Hey, let's do it for the content. Mega Ran. Let's go. Let's get it. Dick Kick City. It gets gritty when Mega Ran come through. The kid gets busy. Work yourself into a shoot, but you know it's legit. Like what you like, just don't be a dick. Hey, wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah. What's that set? Maybe you should bottle it. Drink it and spray it on. Get Claude to model it. 8 years in, can't look back. Who else can make the Lord sweatsuits look whack? Wrestling with regret. Let's get it. Yeah.
I remember the summer of '98 like it was yesterday, man. Sitting with my friends and talking about South Park movie rumors, playing the hell out of my N64, and watching a lot of wrestling on Monday nights. I actually began watching closer to April or May of that year. I got started on WCW after falling in love with the roster via World Tour. I always wanted to see if guys like DDP and Glacier and Wrath were as good in real life as their unlockable status in the game suggested. For a while, I wasn't particularly loyal to one company over the other, but then one fateful Monday night, I flipped over to Raw to catch the main event and saw this. Now, I had no idea what was actually happening here, and I wasn't exactly in tune with the World Wrestling Federation storylines at the time, but walking in on this absolutely batshit moment of a big goth wrestler coming up to the floor to beat the ever-loving fuck out of some big guy in a cage, while a giant monster in red and black's banging on the roof of said cage to get to them, well, wouldn't that have hooked you for life? Monday Night Raw has been a part of my life in some form or fashion ever since that night. I watched it, hang on a second, these glasses are killing me, I gotta take these things off. Older prescriptions, y'all know what I'm talking about. I watched it dutifully from 8th grade all the way through college and beyond. Then after a multi-year falling out where I pretty much read the results and that was it, I finally got back into watching the show because this content won't make itself, am I right? Let's face it, these days there just aren't a lot of reasons to tune into Raw. The booking can be frustrating or boring to watch, and it can be a drag watching a bad 3-hour show. They're somehow able to simultaneously stretch storylines past their shelf life and hotshot things, yet somehow be bad at both of them. So to combat the bad feelings many of us associate with Raw today, we turn to the one thing that will always be there for us, nostalgia. It's time to look back at the good times with my picks for the 8 best years of Monday Night Raw. Like I did with my worst years countdown a year and a half ago, I'm not looking at ratings trends when ranking these, but rather the wrestlers and the matches and the storylines and the moments that made these years what they were. Let's begin. Number 8, 1993. First, we gotta show a little bit of love to the original, the first year of Monday Night Raw, which began in January of '93. Coming from the small but jam-packed Manhattan Center in New York, the atmosphere was very different from that of the stale and overproduced syndicated shows that were synonymous with a bygone era. Simply put, Raw at this time was Bret Hart's show. The Hitman was the cornerstone of his brand new TV endeavor, and the audience treated him like a god. Though the company tried in vain to get the Lex Express up and running, Hart's more modern in-ring style fit perfectly with the longer matches that were featured on this new program. His feud with Jerry Lawler, which as you may recall existed in 2 different dimensions, was one of their biggest of the year and a classic example of how good Jerry could be as a baddie. As the hot new show in the lineup, Raw had an air of unpredictability that hours of Superstars and Wrestling Challenge tapings often didn't have. There was a vibe that anything could happen on the show, and no better was that made clear than on May 17th, the night the Kid beat Razor Ramon in one of the biggest upsets of all time, a match that turned Sean Waltman into a star overnight. And on that same episode, Marty Jannetty emerged from the crowd and beat his old partner Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental title. From the onset, Raw did a very good job distinguishing itself from the old formula. The early setting of the Manhattan Center was iconic, the presentation was unique, and it was successful enough to eventually become the forever golden child of WWE programming. Number 7, 2008. If nothing else, Raw in 2008 can best be defined by 2 people, Shawn Michaels and Chris Jericho, and frankly, to me, that's all you need. HBK's emotional retirement of Ric Flair at WrestleMania 24 set off a wild series of misfortunes for Shawn for the remainder of the year, from betrayals to financial ruin. It all began when Batista got mad at Michaels for ending Flair's career, which, in case you need a reminder, was a mutually agreed upon term of this wrestling match both men had consented to take part in. I'm just saying, Big Dave shouldn't have exactly been shocked by what happened. Eventually, Y2J didn't like the cut of Shawn's jib either, questioning the sexy boy's integrity. It all came to a head in a landmark episode of the highlight reel on Raw when Jericho snapped and drove Shawn's head through a TV monitor, kicking off one of the best runs of Le Champion's entire career. Jericho's evolution from a tired retread of his '99 debut to serious cold-blooded killer in a suit all took place on the Red Show during this year, and it worked to perfection. Jericho and Michaels were intertwined by their hatred for months, and whether their fights were for pride, revenge, or the World Championship, their wars were always intense, giving Raw a real shot in the arm that year. Speaking of the Ric Flair storyline, all the stuff on Raw leading up to that match was pretty darn good too, ending with a beautiful, tear-filled ceremony the night after WrestleMania, one of the best segments in Raw's history. WWE isn't always known for long-term storytelling or sentimentality, but here they were able to pull off both. Finally, 08 saw the arrival of CM Punk as a top name as he cashed in his Money in the Bank to win his first of several world titles. Though he was never placed on the same level as other guys in the brand like Cena or Jericho, it was a watershed moment to see the crowning of one of the biggest stars of that post-boom period indie scene. Number 6, 2014. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, wasn't this one of the peak authority years, that time period where I've gone on record as saying was a really angering time as a fan? Well, yes, but if there's any good to be mined from this storyline, this was the year to do that. 2014 was the year that WWE finally, kicking and screaming, accepted the Yes movement and put Daniel Bryan in the main event of WrestleMania 30. The build on TV was gut-wrenching to watch at times, but it all paid off in the end when Bryan pulled off the major victory in New Orleans. In a way, CM Punk crawled in 2011 so Bryan could fly 3 years later. 2014 also saw the meteoric rise of Seth Rollins as the company's next big player. After a great babyface turn by The Shield, the Architect turned on the group and linked up with the Authority, which resulted in some amazing matches and moments with former brother Dean Ambrose. His biggest year was yet to come, but this is the time that Rollins put in all the work to get there. And after spending 2 years in oddly booked back-and-forth feuds, Brock Lesnar finally became what he was born to be, as the killer of all that is good and happy in the world, beginning with The Undertaker's streak, then dominating to become WWE Champion at SummerSlam. His appearances on Raw that year may have been infrequent, but powerful nonetheless, especially with Paul Heyman singing his praises on the mic. Number 5, 2001. The wrestling landscape at the end of the Monday Night War was a wild and confusing one. 2001's best defined by the infamous Invasion storyline, but now that I'm looking back at it 20 years later, I think it's safe to say that the year was a lot better than many of us give it credit for. I mean, even if you go back to the beginning of the year before everything changed, the WWF was still putting out great content. A war between Stone Cold and Triple H defined the upper card, while the mid card was banging on all cylinders. The McMahon family story was actually pretty entertaining before it got overbearing, as Stephanie was riding the line between conspiring with her father to throw Linda out of the company, but also standing up to him for having an affair with Trish Stratus. There's layers here. Then came the fall of WCW, that legendary simulcast, the final Nitro, and Shane McMahon's war against the WWF. Those early moments with guys like Lance Storm, Hugh Morris, DDP, and Booker T invading Raw were some of the biggest wow moments the show had seen in a minute. And before the invasion angle began showing signs of trouble, we did get that amazeballs ECW invasion for one night that took everyone by surprise. It might not have been the invasion that many fans had hoped for, and let's be honest, getting guys like Hall and Nash and Steiner and Sting might not even have helped. But compared to most of what Raw has been in the 20 years since, it was actually a pretty ambitious one for the WWF. Number 4, 2005. After Randy Orton's main event push was fumbled so hard that its epicness wouldn't be beaten until Mark Sanchez topped it in 2012. 9-year-old NFL references, baby, how about them? WWE went back to the drawing board in early 05 and gave the nod to Batista instead. Who could forget the iconic thumbs down moment that cemented Big Dave's babyface run after weeks of slowly coming around to the truth? The payoff to this was so good, it almost makes you think they meant to make Orton look like a dumb goof for months, so this would be received way better in comparison. But while Batista broke out in a huge way on Raw and went on to flourish on SmackDown, the same could not quite be said for his counterpart John Cena. As Cena's toppling of Raw stars went on unabated for months, the fans actually turned on the guy who was supposed to be the top babyface. Now this makes for an interesting question. Because the fans were vocally turning on Cena and therefore part of the product they were putting out, does that not disqualify this year from being one of the good ones? Well, if anything, I'd say it actually made the show more compelling to watch because you never knew how wild the fans were gonna get. And if the fans are buying tickets to boo or cheer the same guy and the company's making money either way, then mission accomplished, right? The year was also a major turning point for future Hall of Famer Edge after real life reared its ugly head. An affair between him and Lita had been made public, so storylines were changed to blur the line between reality and fiction to great success. Edge was already a heel beforehand, but the legitimate heat that he and Lita had in the aftermath helped him become one of the biggest of that decade. And even though it wound up being a one-sided feud that was seemingly designed specifically to humiliate humiliate him, Matt Hardy's firing and rehiring to battle Edge made for some great television at a time when unpredictability was in short supply. And lest we forget, 2005 was the home of one of WWE's greatest social experiments in Muhammad Hassan. The Arab American living in a post-9/11 world spent the bulk of his on-air career on Raw during this year, and as has been mentioned often on this channel, it was very captivating until things got a little too real on SmackDown. Number 3. 1998. 1998 was the year that changed the WWF's fortunes forever, and it pretty much began and ended with one guy. The company's notorious Attitude rebrand would simply not have been possible without the contributions of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and '98 was his year. From mixing it up with Mike Tyson to the various and wildly entertaining ways he caused chaos for Mr. McMahon, the Rattlesnake was the object of adulation from millions of viewers, yours truly included. The Austin-McMahon feud was a cultural touchstone that may have likely saved the company as we know it. McMahon's use of corporate champions against Austin helped breathe more life into the feud. Take, for instance, his periodic exploitation of Mick Foley in the months after WrestleMania. When Foley finally broke away from Vince at the end of the year, he'd become the second biggest babyface in the company, which is pretty impressive when Stone Cold's still on the roster. This year also saw the rise of DX as the group expanded its numbers and got more ballsy in their execution, pardon the phrase. Seeing DX drive around in a Jeep they keep calling a tank and trying to barge into an episode of Nitro was just plain unheard of then. And then there was The Rock. '98 was also the year the Great One came into his own. Leading the Nation of Domination for more than half the year and having a strong run with the IC title, Rocky's star power was too strong to ignore. The Rock lost the belt to Triple H at SummerSlam, but it was a clear case of the loser being the real winner. Without the mid-card title holding him back, Rock was immediately promoted to the main event scene, and after a 2-month babyface run that only served to distract fans from the company's real long-term plans, The Rock was revealed as Vince McMahon's final choice as corporate champion. Number 2. 2000. The WWF was in somewhat of a state of disarray at the start of the year. Steve Austin was out with an injury and gone as the top star, and Vince Russo was no longer the company's head writer. Sounds daunting at first, but it turns out neither of these things really mattered because the year 2000 was one of the best the company ever had. While 1998 was the year of Austin and McMahon, 2000 was the year of Triple H and The Rock. With Austin and Undertaker both out of the picture for a while, the company put all its eggs into Triple H's basket as the top heel in the company. But the game more than proved his worth with a series of great competitive matches with everyone from The Rock to Chris Jericho to Taka Michinoku. Rocky, meanwhile, found himself in the unenviable position of trying to fill Austin's shoes as a #1 babyface. Any doubts of his ability to do so were soon erased, as The Rock not only matched Austin behind the mic, but arguably exceeded him in the charisma department. In fact, The Rock may have been a bit too good, as this year was his last as a full-time wrestler before Hollywood came calling. And let's see, 2000 also gave us the Radicals jumping ship from WCW, one of the greatest tag divisions in history, anchored by the Dudleys, the Hardys, and Edge and Christian. And oh yeah, it was Kurt Angle's first full year in the company. Need I say more? And my pick for the greatest year of Monday Night Raw is 1997. At the beginning of '97, the WWF found itself backed into a corner. WCW was crushing them on a regular basis, and the company's champion Shawn Michaels was on the verge of a breakdown. Creatively, the company was stuck trying to recapture the glory of the '80s, but were only able to turn things around by defying every standard they'd stood for up to that point. The year was mostly dominated by two men, Steve Austin and Bret Hart. The freshness of the roguish Austin being embraced by the fans, and the once virtuous Hart seemingly spoiled by bitterness and resentment that the company was passing him by, marked a sea change the Federation had desperately needed for most of that decade. Austin's neck injury at SummerSlam '97 forced the WWF to improvise with weekly beatdowns of officials, keeping Austin relevant while also keeping him safe, peaking with a well-timed stunner in Madison Square Garden. '97 was a rare window when the Federation even collaborated with other companies. Though a partnership with AAA was short-lived and ultimately forgettable, Paul Heyman's ECW got a huge boost in credibility as the company prepared for their inaugural barely legal pay-per-view. ECW stars made their way to Raw and made their mark, proving this invasion to be arguably more successful than the one in 2001. Another vast change in the company's presentation was allowing their talent to actually have layers and depth to their personas. Instead of The Undertaker being presented as a literal ghoul risen from the dead, we were informed he was a man with a family and a complicated past. Mankind, once merely a deranged monster, could reveal himself as Mick Foley and discuss his motivations for his desire to put himself through unspeakable pain on a nightly basis. But perhaps no one capitalized on the company's embrace of edginess more than Shawn Michaels. After spending most of spring and summer off either unable or unwilling to perform, Shawn was finally allowed to be paired on screen with his fellow clickmate Triple H, and the rest, as they say, is history. Just as the NWO began to grow stale in WCW, DX offered a younger, cooler, less bloated version of the cool heels. The strides that were made in 1998 through 2000 were huge, but it was 1997 where the building blocks were put in place to help put the WWF on the path to success, changing the game forever. And that's why 97 is my pick for the greatest year in the history of Raw. Well, that was a fun trip through memory lane. What years do you think stand out for Raw? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.